Welcome back, Canon Catholic. So, where did we leave off today? Thank you, Quinn. That's right. We were talking about the Crusades, right? I also heard y'all back there, Danny and Rafi. I heard you back there as well. That's Dan McKinnon, just Dan McKinnon, actually. Rafi, I heard you too. Appreciate the help. Now, we talked about fighting the Crusades, right? And we talked about some of the more kind of tame parts of it. Talked about how, like, the First Crusade was all about the Christian knights coming in and setting up these, like, 4 strongholds, right? And that was all about just, like, keeping provincial control over the Holy Land. Well, then in the Second Crusade, Muslim forces are going to invade, and they're going to take over one of these areas, trying to take Jerusalem back. A lot of different stuff like that. And then the Third Crusade, the Muslims are going to regain control of the Holy Land, and then King Richard is going to come and fight them. He's going to lead a big band of nobles and stuff like that, but then he's going to, like, leave defeated, right? So Richard the Lionheart, and he's going to be kidnapped, which is a funny story. So King Richard the Lionheart and Saladin respected each other when attempted for peace, but Richard is going to end up having to go back to England due to not capturing Jerusalem. And as you can see, this is one of the modern-day shots of Jerusalem. It is absolutely beautiful. And it's really, really cool because you can actually see some of the Christian crosses as well as a Christian burial site. And this is actually one of the old walls of the Holy Land, which is really, really cool. But yeah, so it's a very, very hard-fought-over area. Now, Fourth and later Crusades. Yes, there was more than just 3 for once. When we talked about the Persian Wars, there were 3. Well, not technically. There was 2 invasions and a rebellion. But when we talked about the Punic Wars, there were 3. It's a lot of 3-set wars. Well, the Crusades, there's multiple. Tons of them, right? So Crusaders attacked Constantinople, led to a disorganization and lack of strong leadership, and which is going to cause the Fourth Crusade, which is another massive failure. 5 more Crusades followed, but the Muslims remained in control of the Holy Land itself, Jerusalem, Damascus, and the Nazareth area, right? So that trifold area that the Christians actually wanted access to. Now, the main thing to understand about this is in your mind when you're thinking about crusading knights and those scumbags across the street, you're like thinking in a long run that, you know, romanticism, right? The idea is that the Christian knights were doing the right thing, right? That they were actually going after certain areas in a provincial way. Well, the thing about it is that they actually really weren't. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we romanticize them and create stories of, like, innocence and things like that. So write romanticism, Romanticism, and then underline it twice, and then put a star next to it. And then underneath that, write the Children's Crusade. I'm going to tell that story tomorrow, all right? It's very funny, but it's like an aspect of romanticism. But go ahead and skip over that, and we're going to talk about effects of the Crusades real fast. Now, the effects of the Crusades in general, though, many of them include economic, political, and social changes. The economic changes in particular, trade and trade goods are going to increase after the Crusades. A lot of this has to do with cultural diffusion, right? Remember, cultural diffusion is going to happen through war or trade. Also, war can sometimes increase trade, right? So there's going to be a massive upping of trade and trade goods that are going to increase after the Crusades. Political changes, some of these include the fact that some lords are not going to be returning to their land, which is going to lead to the king actually confiscating that land, giving the king more power. So after the Crusades, the power of the kings began to grow. Write that down underneath the political changes. Power of kings began to grow, and the centralization of governments began to rise up. Social changes, though, also include is that many Christians are going to see Jews and Muslims as the enemy, while Muslims saw Christians as invaders, right? So social changes increase as the big 3 religions continue to fracture apart from one another, leading to social unrest, bias, and also injustice. And a lot of this also goes back especially onto the Jewish populations of Europe, which basically have integrated their ways into the societies of many of the countries that existed, or not the countries, but the kingdoms that existed at the time. All right, so continuing forward, though, a couple things about the Crusades that are kind of odd that not a lot of you realize, and it's very, very important to understand. So we talked about the grand scheme of the Crusades in general. We didn't really talk about how the Crusades are just a little bit weird in a way, because they don't really mirror a lot of the things that you would think about like an actual holy war, and they don't really, it's not just Jews versus Muslims versus Christians. It's actually much more along the lines of the leaders in power at the time, why they did the things that they did, and what were their motivations. So first and foremost, before the First Crusade, this is actually kind of mind-blowing, nobles constantly fought one another for control over their land. So Urban II actually, wanted to unite Europe against a common enemy, right? Now, really, really quickly, I need to fact check that because for some reason I think that that's actually Urban I, and that I just put it up there wrong. Urban II, 1099, and the Crusades. Oh, nope, it is Urban II. Urban I, I think, is the one that was one of the multiple popes at the time, the popes of Avignon. Now, anyway, so Urban II just wanted to unite the people of Europe against a common enemy. All right, a lot of this actually does great things for him because mainly it makes him more money in the tithe. There's less disruption among the church communities, and that way he makes more money in the long run. So, continuing forward, though, also the Pope never claimed that the Crusades were actually a holy war. He said that he sent them on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, hoping that the the Nation of Islam would attack them and actually cause a war itself. So that's another massive thing as well. Pilgrimage. You see why pilgrimage is all bold and in quotes? Circle it like 14 times, and because that's massively important because it's literally going to come up in your test, and I kid you not. All right. Anyway, so the last thing though is most of the Crusaders. We talked about this in class. So you don't necessarily need to write this down unless we're not going to remember it. But most of the Crusaders were actually nobles who were leading bands of poor people. Not very few of them were knights, very few of them wore armor, and very few of them could really even afford the ability to go on a crusade alone. They actually went with their lord, right? And then the feudal system off their fief. Now, that's going to be where we're going to stop for today. And tomorrow we're going to get into life during the High Middle Ages, talk a little bit about the church and how that was all set up and how like your life focused around that, as well as like the rise of universities and scholasticism. And also the last thing we'll talk about is like architecture and the growth of governmental powers, right? So that's pretty much it, but I will see you tomorrow, Camden Catholic, and good job.